Good afternoon, everybody. As people start to load into the session today, we're going to just quickly run a video advertising the Urban Land Institute spring meeting that we'll be hosting here in Toronto for the very first time this coming May. Thank you. ULI Toronto, as mentioned earlier at the top, prepares to welcome 4,000 international experts from across the real estate and land use industries to Toronto next May, the 16th to 18th. This is your chance to make a valuable connection, listen to unparalleled speakers, and join exclusive tours. To learn more about the 2023 ULI Spring Meeting, there'll be shared links in the chat. Also want to just quickly remind people that it is never a better time to become a member of ULI than it is now. There's just so much value to the work that we do, whether it's accessing the global membership directory, connecting in through Navigator, the many volunteer opportunities that ULI Toronto and internationally has to offer, getting access to past attendees, an amazing networking tool, including not just past, but upcoming attendees for future events. You'll know who's in the room before you get there. And then the unparalleled knowledge finder, literally decades, nearly 60 years of archival information, easily found, case studies, best practices, and so forth, that you can find through Knowledge Finder. All of these things are benefits of being a member. So we encourage you to consider this if you're not already, or take advantage of these things if you are a member and you haven't. Once again, good afternoon. My name is Richard Joy, Executive Director of ULI Toronto, and I'm pleased to be hosting today's session. I'm pleased to have ULI host this session, Housing Affordability Crisis in the GTA. How deep is it? Important conversation. This is the first webinar of 5-part series, lunchtime throughout this week being, of course, National Housing Week. No issue has dominated the political and industry agenda more in recent years than housing costs and affordability, now ranked the top social and political issue among the respondents of this year's PwC ULI Emerging Trends in Real Estate Survey for the very first time. From market affordable to deeply subsidized housing, the challenge to arrest spiraling home ownership costs, rent increases, and basic shelter needs appears out of control. Before we get into this, as always, we begin with a land acknowledgement. As a Toronto region-based organization, we acknowledge that the land we are meeting on virtually is the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat people, and is now home to many diverse First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people. We acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We are all treaty people. Many of us have come here as settlers, immigrants, and newcomers in this generation or generations past. ULI Toronto stands in solidarity with Indigenous communities demanding action and accountability for the ongoing legacy of the residential school system. We also like to acknowledge and honor those who've come here involuntarily, particularly descendants from those who brought here through enslavement. To better understand the meaning behind this land acknowledgement, we recommend four programs that we've uploaded to YouTube, and these will be available in the chat, these links. Today's event and all other ULI programming would simply not be possible without ULI's annual sponsors. I would like to thank all of the annual sponsors for this support. Now more than ever, ULI Toronto relies on the support of our sponsors to put on high quality programs such as today's and to drive our mission to shape the future of the built environment for transformative impact in communities worldwide. To all of our sponsors, we say thank you. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Leslie Wu, CEO of Civic Action and a member of our governance committee. I'm especially pleased to have Leslie moderate this first National Housing Week's webinar, not only because of her deep roots within the Urban Land Institute, both locally and globally, but also her capacity at Civic Action. Very much a fellow traveler for a not-for-profit organization committed to advancing the well-being of our city by harnessing the broad leadership of our region, examples of which you will soon be introduced to. Before I hand it over to Leslie, I want to make note that to our audience that ULI is a nonpartisan organization, does not advocate on public policy, pro or con. We frequently take a critical look at public policy landscape in the context of advancing our global mission. We'll put that link in the chat as well, please, which we are doing today, of course. So with that, Leslie, I'm handing over the reins to you. I will come back if we are able to do audience questions, and we probably are going to be challenged, but if we're able to tuck in a few audience questions, they are available in the Q&A. I will monitor those, and if you feel that we are able to have some time, Leslie, I'll bring those in at the very end. Otherwise, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard, and thanks to ULI Toronto for the opportunity to moderate this important discussion. Anytime the word crisis is in a sentence, I pay attention. And so it's it's great to be here. I'm going to be joined by 5 remarkable leaders in the region and in the city. Isabel Cascante, Director of Research, Public Policy and Evaluation of the United Way, GTA. Dr. Nimoy Lewis from the School of Urban and Regional Planning at TMU. Derek Goring, EVP Development at Northcrest, and Gila Omar Kale, VP Social Impact at the Daniels Corporation, and Craig Rutan, Senior Director Policy at the Toronto Region Board of Trade. And as a footnote, Craig is also a Civic Action Diversity Fellow. Each of the panelists are going to have an opportunity to respond to the statement I'm about to make around the situation we find ourselves in. So what happens when a crisis goes on so long, many start to believe it's normal. Some would say that is the state that was the state of housing affordability before the pandemic. And the quote unquote worsening crisis, therefore, can be considered a deepening and widening of the problem that is now impacting not only equity deserving communities, as it has been for quite a long time, but many who in the past may have seen a clear pathway to homeownership or shelter. That path is now available to fewer and fewer. Despite all levels of government voicing the words for change, the say-do gap continues. Each of our invited panelists has been asked to offer their view on whether we are on the right track or the wrong track in delivering affordable housing, including market affordability and subsidized housing. Over the next series of webinars today, you'll hear different views around supply, demand, around the issue of housing affordability. But I think in this opening webinar, which I'm so grateful ULI Toronto and Richard and the team have voiced, we're going to take a wider view zoom out and really ask ourselves this question around the nature of the quote unquote crisis. So I'm going to turn it over first to Isabel to kick us off with her opening statements about the nature of this crisis.
Great, thanks, Leslie. Great to be here. At United Way, our vision is a united Greater Toronto region where every neighborhood is inclusive, strong, and vibrant, and everyone has an opportunity to build a better life. For me, grounding the conversation in this vision adds a really critical equity lens, Leslie, as you referenced, to the question of being on the right or wrong track. I would ask, for whom? What neighborhoods, what residents are being prioritized? And on the flip side, who is being left behind? United Way, in partnership with David Holchansky and his team at the Neighborhood Change Research Partnership and the Tower Renewal Partnership, released a paper last November. You see it up on the screen. It's called Vertical Legacy, and it looks at the state of legacy towers in the GTA, specifically Peel, Toronto, and York region. The legacy towers, as many of you know, are these post-war, mostly privately owned rental apartment towers that dot the GTA landscape. We were looking both at high-rise as well as mid-rise, looking at buildings that are 5 stories plus. And we know in the region there are over 2,000 towers, and that equals more than 200,000 units. So it's a fairly specific focus, but we really see these towers as a microcosm of interconnected structural gaps and barriers underpinning our housing affordability challenges. I'm going to share just really quickly some of the relevant findings just to help ground the conversation. We know legacy towers are relatively more affordable. High-rise tenants pay on average 13% less than average market rents. But we also know that these units are under threat by this rental supply gap, which really enables building owners to increase rents. This is happening incrementally between tenants or more drastically through renovations, which tend to be mostly cosmetic with few advantages really for tenants. The incomes of high-rise renters lag far behind the incomes of other renters and homeowners. You'll see this on the slide here. The real average wage of high-rise renters, the data here is between 1980 and 2015, increased only 5% for high-rise renters compared to 19% for other renters and 41% for homeowners. Next slide, please. So despite the relative affordability of these legacy towers, the stagnant purchasing powers of high-rise renters means a significant number are living in core housing need. Again, this is from 2016. Almost 50% of high-rise tenants paid more than 30% of their income on rent. We've also layered in the 50% benchmark here with a significant portion paying more than that. And this really reflects the depth of the unaffordability challenge or the affordability crisis. Really at this 50% benchmark is where people need to start making really difficult trade-offs and choosing between groceries or paying for medical costs, for instance. The final slide is really digging into the housing inequities and showing that they are really symptomatic of broader structural inequities, including racism and discrimination. You see here in the GTA, almost half of all high-rise apartment renter households live in low income. More than half are racialized or Indigenous peoples. And when we layer in the geography, and this is really the most interesting piece of the data that we presented in this report, is that when we layer in geography and community, which is really necessary when we talk about our cities, we begin to see the spatial and racial concentrations of poverty, of high-rise renters in low-income neighborhoods. We see here the highest concentrations of renters living in high-rise apartments in low-income neighborhoods are Black, Filipino, and South Asian renters. So these data points remind us that housing affordability is about people. There's a whole bunch of other data points that we could layer in, both from this report and a host of other reports. But the findings point to a few considerations when assessing our progress. Most critically, solutions must be centered in equity. Unaffordability is impacting historically and structurally disadvantaged groups more deeply than others, and this has serious ripple effects. There's a whole body of research that explores connections between place and health outcomes. They recognize our neighborhoods are a structural determinant of health, and this includes housing, as well as other really important and intersecting pillars like transportation, access to decent employment opportunities, culturally responsive social and healthcare services, and of course, opportunities for civic engagement, for residents to be truly engaged and informed decisions in their communities. All this to say, we need to be thinking of housing and affordable housing within the larger city building sphere, where other elements of what make truly inclusive communities come together. But on housing specifically, because that was the question specifically, we need more options for people on the lower end of the income spectrum so that they can access stable housing. This requires more serious commitment both to preserving existing affordable housing, like the legacy towers, and to building more deeply affordable and supportive housing, including subsidized and rent-geared-to income units. There are some promising initiatives showing us what is possible across the region. Programs like the Rapid Housing Initiative are supporting development of permanent affordable housing. The Social Medicine Initiative is a great example. This is a collaboration that United Way is involved in partnership with University Health Network and the City of Toronto. That's developing supportive modular housing for individuals exiting or at risk of homelessness. The Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust is doing some great work to preserve existing affordable units in perpetuity. We need to learn from these initiatives and understand them and figure out how to scale them, or at least the elements from them that are working. There are also supportive policies that are part of the solution. Rent control is good. I think vacancy control, limiting rent increases between tenants would be better and more helpful. Rental unit replacement and right to return policies have been successful at maintaining affordability and reducing displacement of residents during neighborhood change processes. We need to keep these in place. And finally, from a broader social policy lens, a livable minimum wage, enhanced social assistance rates that keep up with rising costs of living go a long way to helping rebalance the wages and costs and help us achieve the strong vision of strong, vibrant, inclusive communities I started my comments with. So there's more to say, but I think I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks so much, Gila. And maybe now I could turn it over to Dr. Nimoy Lewis. Nimoy, over to you.
Thank you, Leslie. So one of the things that I think in answering this question is we need to think about like how we even arrived here. And one of the things that we have to take note is back in the early to mid 1990s, when the federal government and the provincial government got out of the housing business, we left a huge gap behind for the private sector to fill that gap. And as a result, we've seen a proliferation of financialized landlords in the market. What are financialized landlords? These are landlords such as private equity firms, asset management firms, pension funds, insurance companies, and other financial intermediaries that essentially invest in housing for the sole purposes of maximizing the returns on their investments for their shareholders and investors. One of the things that helped with this proliferation was the policy changes that we saw back in 1997, which included the introduction of vacancy decontrol and the introduction of above guideline increases, which allows a landlord to download capital expenditures that are not calculated in the annual provincial guideline increase. As you can see from this particular chart here, in 1997, we saw a jump in the amount of rental units acquired by financialized landlords. But I want to take our attention to 2018 and actually 2019, and where financialized landlords particularly dominated the market, but one particular entity dominated the market was Starlight Investment, who we all know is the largest multifamily landlord in this country with over 61,000 units. In Toronto, they have at least nearly half of their portfolio within this city alone. And in 2018, of that 6,881 units that were acquired by financialized landlords, Starlight alone accounted for 48% of those multifamily units that were acquired during that single year. Even in 2019, of that 6,477, Starlight accounted for 77%, which they acquired approximately 5,011 units in a single year alone in the city. And they continue to dominate the market. And so what does that look like in terms of the housing ecosystem in Toronto? Next slide. And so what we see here from my research, what we found is that, although that there's a lot of attention that's paid towards REITs, the difficulty is that REITs only account for 7% of the units that have been acquired since 1995. But the true culprits, I argue, are asset management firms and numbered companies and even private investors. And I should say that with respect to the private investors and numbered companies, these are probably an undercount with respect to those particular entities that would be classified as financialized landlords. Typically, as we all know, that some of these corporate entities like to use ambiguous names as such, and also don't have a digital footprint online. So it makes it even difficult to classify these particular entities as financialized landlords. So I do want to say that this is most likely an undercount, but I also want to bring our attention to even family-owned offices, and these are portfolios that are owned by families. And one of the things that I want to stress, despite the name family, that sometimes helps to humanize the business practices of these entities. I want to reiterate that, make no mistake, that these entities are no different from than the financialized landlords, such as asset management firms and private equity firms, and even pension funds. And as I mentioned, one of the ways that some of these entities generate some of their income is through above guideline increases, which we know helps to exacerbate the affordability and displacement problems in many communities, especially in vulnerable communities. Next slide. And as you can see, from 2000, over a 12-year period, financialized landlords have actually accounted for nearly 50% of all the AGI applications that were filed alone in this city, and with Starlight leading the way. Next slide. With 203 AGI applications since 2010. And as you can see, the number of units that are impacted is significant. Though, as you can see, Cap REIT, which is a real estate investment trust, has, despite the fact that they've filed less application, but they have more impacted units. But that is also because a lot of the buildings that are within Cap REIT's portfolio are high-rise buildings, and they're filing for a lot more applications at these particular post-war suburban buildings. But I also want to bring our attention to BCIMC Realty Corp, which is the management arm that manages the BC public sector's pension fund. As you can see, they are heavily invested as well within the Toronto housing ecosystem, and through their similar practices as the other financialized landlords, are also applying for these AGIs in order to exacerbate the affordability and displacement problems. Next slide. And so evictions is a big problem in the city. And as you can see, between 2019 and 2021, financialized landlords have accounted for 33% of the eviction applications for non-payment of rent. Typically with these firms is the main business model is to maximize returns, and the one ways to do that is to have high occupancy and high rents. And so as a result, you want to expeditiously remove non-paying tenants immediately because they disrupt their portfolio and projected returns. But I also want to stress that, again, with respect to the private investor, this might be an undercount, as I mentioned before, largely because a lot of these companies, again, use ambiguous names. So we're unable to classify those particular entities as a financialized landlord. Next slide. And so, and with respect to of that 14,000, as you can see from this particular graph, that 82% of the eviction applications that are filed by these particular landlords are evictions for non-payment of rent and to collect the rent that is owed to them. And so I argue that at the current moment, I don't think that we're headed into the right direction, considering some of the policies that that have been introduced within the last 5 years, even with in 2018, where the current government excluded rent control on properties that were built after November 2018. And as you can see, while there's a big push and concern about supply, we have to think about as well, what are the policies and practices and actors that are also causing us to lose some of the last remaining affordable housing in the market. I think in order to address some of these issues, I think in agreement with Isabel, I think that we do need vacancy control to help in order to help provide a bit more predictability with respect to once a tenant moves out of the unit, that they know that they will have the same rent from the previous tenant. I think the other thing that we need to do as well is that we need to explore some of the anti-competition laws within the housing market, largely because of the fear that this market is currently ripe to create an oligopolistic rental market, and where we'd have a small number of big players that are controlling the market. And where we see in terms of the transaction trends is that we see a lot of the bigger players are either acquiring a lot of the portfolios of the smaller entities. And this is not only happening in Toronto, but we also see this happening in the Montreal market as well. So definitely one of the things that I think that we need to do is explore those options, and also to put a cap on these particular entities and the number of units they have in their possession. And I'll leave it right there.
Thanks so much, Nimoy, and thank you, Isabel. And I think we can take down the screen because I'm going to ask Derek Goring to step into the fray.
Thanks, Leslie. I appreciate being able to participate in the session today. So first, I'd like to start by acknowledging that I do think that we are in a crisis and that we can and should work together to address this challenge. But I also think it's important to acknowledge some really big trends and related context factors to assess where we are now and what the art of the possible is. So first, on the demand side of the equation, there's a lot of pressure on the demand side. So first, economic demographic trends. We have national immigration targets that are significant and increasing. We have global move towards urbanization generally, and the sort of not so recent emergence of these global mega regions, which kind of act as centers of gravity for population. And Toronto is one of those. Canada generally and Toronto specifically are incredible places to live and work, and especially when you look at it compared to other places in the world, and this comes across consistently in various global rankings. Our region is welcoming to people from around the world and from any background, and notwithstanding that we certainly have our issues, I'm making the case that on a relative basis and across a broad range of factors, where else would you really want to be if you had a choice? And obviously, I'm a proud Torontonian. And so this part of the story, frankly, is a good news story that we should be proud of, but it does create a lot of pressure on the housing stock and on infrastructure. On the supply side, we've certainly not been keeping up with population growth for a long time. The problem is getting worse. We could do better on things like the timing for approvals, labor availability, labor productivity, and a bunch of other factors that contribute to how quickly and how much housing we can deliver as an industry. There are policies that have been talked about for a long time that would help that haven't happened yet, including getting rid of the yellow belt, residential density or residential zoning. We are making progress on this front, but it's been too slow. I would argue rent control legislation starting in the 70s essentially stopped the supply of new rental housing stock by the private sector for the better part of 40 years, which didn't help either. Further, we have had a long period of low interest rates and low inflation globally, which inflated all asset prices, not just housing, to historically high levels. We've had significant inward investment in Canadian real estate from foreign investors. And as Nimoy pointed out earlier, in the 80s and 90s, senior governments essentially stopped funding new affordable housing and cut funding to municipalities, which led to underinvestments in existing affordable housing stock and related infrastructure. Now, not all of these things are bad, but each of them have contributed to more expensive housing. But together, all of these things have really had an enormous impact on housing affordability. So my point here is not to lay blame or point fingers. It's really just making the point that there's been a lot of pressure on housing affordability over many years, and the momentum has been picking up speed. So the reality is we shouldn't be surprised by where we are. And so now we have to address, where we can go from here. As Richard mentioned at the beginning, attention on this issue has been rising, which is good and necessary. There are a lot of things happening, but momentum of this sort takes a long time to slow down, and building more affordable housing takes a long time, as any housing projects do. There are some really good things that are being done, including programs, but clearly we need to do more. And the current economic trends, including higher interest rates and higher construction costs, have certainly made things more difficult in the short term. I do want to point out that as an industry, we've been building more housing than any other large region in North America for the past 20 years. This was highlighted in the video that Richard showed at the beginning. The active crane count is just one example of that. It just hasn't been enough to keep up with the really, really high levels of demand that we've experienced. And in my opinion, the NIMBY forces here in the GTA are not actually as strong as they are in other places. So I don't think that's the main issue. There is a tendency to simplify the issue. And so Nimoy also mentioned this, there's some people are advocating that, just adding more supply will solve the problem. I don't think that's the case, but I do think more supply is necessary. So it's not about focusing on one aspect of the challenge. It's really about working together to tackle as many of these different challenges as possible at the same time. And I genuinely think we can make material improvements in housing affordability. But I also think we need to manage expectations about what is realistically achievable. Toronto is one of the best places in the world to live, and I think it will continue to be that way. We have an open, encouraging immigration system, which I strongly support. But as we make progress on housing affordability, it will make it an even better place to live and will actually lead to more demand, which will in turn put more pressure on prices. So in my opinion, it's not really a problem you can actually solve. I don't think we're ever going to make Toronto a place that's cheap to live. And we're not going to reverse things like urbanization and the advance of these global mega regions and the need to build more densely to save the planet from climate change. But we can and should do more to make things better, including making housing more affordable for everyone and delivering more dedicated affordable housing for those who need it. And I do think that we can succeed in this. Leslie?
Perfect timing, Derek. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Gila from the Daniels Corps. Gila, Daniels and yourself have been spending a lot of time in this space. Maybe share your perspective on this quote unquote crisis.
Thanks so much, Leslie, and great to be participating in this discussion. Hopefully Derek doesn't mind, but I'm going to borrow some terminology he used in terms of the art of the possible. And really, that's what I'd like to focus on. Derek also highlighted that we don't have just a supply issue on our hands. To actually address this crisis, there's no single solution or silver bullet, which we always find in a crisis situation. And in this case, it's not supply. It's, there needs to be an increase of supply, but also how do we increase the diversity of housing and make sure there is a mix of type, tenure, and affordability levels. And to do that, we really do need to rely on that art of what's possible and look for creative opportunities and a cross-sectoral approach. This is certainly not going to be solved by the development industry alone, or by government alone, or by the not-for-profit housing sector alone. We really need a whole of society approach to tackle this crisis. And I want to really focus on some examples, that may not get us hundreds of units really quickly, but they get hundreds of people into homes. And that is really with a focus on partnerships. For example, Habitat for Humanity Greater Toronto Area and the Black North Initiative have a partnership to create affordable housing for Black families. As developers, how do we collaborate with Habitat and BNI to bring these units to the market and actually make them available to families in need? Similarly, we know that there are not-for-profit organizations, many specializing in housing, but many specializing in other sectors like accessibility, that do have access to capital to make housing projects happen, but have been traditionally left out. For example, Daniels is partnering with a group called L'Arche Toronto, and L'Arche deals with people with intellectual disabilities to provide a range of services from housing to employment to arts programming. And what we're doing with L'Arche is actually building a fully accessible 8-bedroom co-housing unit that will be supportive housing for folks living with intellectual disabilities, as well as folks who are looking to co-house in an affordable housing solution. And this will be integrated with a market condominium building so that these opportunities don't have to rely on big tracts of land and dedicated buildings, but really an approach to integration and inclusivity. I also want to shed light on another program we're doing with BNI, which is around live-work units for artists. So actually carving out space within our buildings. We all talk about, animation, eyes on the street. Well, how do we do that? And one sector traditionally left out is artists. So actually creating dedicated homes and workspace for artists in partnership with groups like BNI, who have a direct link to those artists. And then in Regent Park as well, most recently, we've done 2 forms of affordable housing initiatives, one with rentals and one in condominiums. In the rental sector, we actually partnered with the City of Toronto and Wood Green Community Services, as well as our partners at Sun Life, to create 34 units of affordable housing for mother-led families. And those units are managed through a head lease with Wood Green. And then in another condominium building, we carved out $5 million as deferred profit to make down payment assistance available to residents of Regent Park, who, again, through issues of equity, have been traditionally left out of the housing market. I highlight these simply as examples that can be taken on the road to developments across the city, to partnerships with different groups, as long as we're thinking creatively and innovatively. And then really pairing some of those with tools like living wages, like social procurement, employing people from communities in our businesses, and really looking at this, like Isabel and Nimoy mentioned, from an equity lens. I'll end there.
Thanks so much, Gila, for that passionate call out for what we need. Our final panelist, Craig, I'm going to ask Craig to step up and give his remarks, and then we're going to move into some discussion with the panel in general.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Leslie. And I will keep this brief so we can get to the questions. Lots of great territory covered by the other panelists. At the Board of Trade, we're really focused on housing as a competitiveness issue for our region, of ensuring that there's enough housing to accommodate our growing workforce. And that's a workforce that's at all income levels. So really, one of the ways we see this is as 3 different crises that are all happening at the same time. Crisis in social housing that has not seen a lot of growth in the number of rent geared to income units that are available. A crisis in affordable housing where prices have continued rising beyond those of limited means, particularly low and middle income workers. And again, a set of policy tools that are trying to grow the share of housing that is, capital A, affordable, below market rent, but going too slow to meet the needs and the backlog that we're seeing. And then the third crisis is in attainable housing. And that the most headlines recently in terms of market rate housing and the cost of home ownership, particularly spiraling over the last decade and really getting out of the control of anyone without access to intergenerational wealth. Almost no matter what your salary or income level is at the moment, it is unimaginable to think about getting into the property market in really any way. And so in terms of that, where we are focused on addressing these crises is trying to find some of the solutions that can lift all of those boats and help to address the different pieces. And one of those main tools is supply. Agree with the other panelists, it's not the only tool that we have to use or that we need to be using. But in terms of how do we think about really unlocking the ability for all of these projects to go forward and to build more of the housing that we need, areas like wide upzoning, both in around transit stations and in neighborhoods across the city and really across the province. And also to explore what are some of those, to Gila's point, partnership models where we can start to increase the supply of housing, maybe for specific worker groups. So I'll leave it there and let us jump into the questions.
Thanks so much, Craig. And I'll ask all the panelists to put their videos back on, and we're going to get going on a number of questions here. So interestingly enough, all of you have spoke about it. There are a couple of common themes that have come up. Gila emphasized the importance of the fact that it's not a silver bullet. It's going to take an all hands on deck approach to wrestle down what I call one of our gnarliest problems facing us. So there are lots of opportunities for greater collaboration, whether it's between different levels of government or different sectors. And I'm going to cross this over with kind of make it a slightly longer question, because the other part of what all of you, many of you have talked about, is the fact that our policy and our public policies aren't sufficient to address the issues at hand. So talk a little bit about what you think the opportunities are for greater collaboration among sectors or amongst levels of government, specifically around the gaps in policy that were alluded to in some of your conversations. Who would like to tackle that one first? Any public policy folks want to dive in?
I'm happy to jump in first and then
Thanks,
turn it over
Greg.
to others.
Thank you.
I want to actually point to an example from BC that I find really interesting. There, they've done a lot of workforce housing and bringing on partners who are interested in building it for their own constituencies. A great example is the General Laborers Union in Vancouver acquired a number of sites and is in the midst of developing them collectively near a transit station that will include new offices for them and also a hefty range of affordable rental homes that will be targeted largely at their sort of workers' income bracket, not limited just to their members, but to folks who are in sort of that general, workers' income bracket. And so I think when I see that, I think that is a great example of a partnership that's pushing things forward. And when we look at some of the policy gaps, I think that there's more to uncover in terms of how the federal government can incentivize that. If we need to dramatically increase the rate that we're building at and the number of units being built. And I think that means bringing some non-traditional partners to the table, like labor unions, like employers, like institutions that have some of their own land holdings. And I think there's a question of whether the federal government has any tax tools in its arsenal that could be used to incentivize those investments and to, whether it's a write-off or something. But if this is an activity that we would like more organizations to do, then I think we can talk about some of the policy structures that the federal government can do to incentivize that.
Anybody else want to chime in? I mean, is this just a political problem? What are the barriers to advancing good public policy around affordable housing it's not like no one studied it. It's well studied, well thought of. There seems to be a gap between the act of saying what is right and doing. So Nimoy.
I think one of the biggest problems as well is that we have all different levels of government who are trying to tackle this problem and creating policies that sometimes contradict with each other. And it doesn't help when, the federal government is, from the previous budget, they had talked about investigating the role of financialized landlords in the market. But yet, we have to understand that the federal government's jurisdiction isn't residential tenancy. So, how could you investigate a particular actors within the market if you don't actually, or you're not actually working alongside with provinces in drafting particular legislations to protect or to safeguard tenants to ensure affordability. I think the other problem is as well when we think about when we think about even with policy is that sometimes that we're offering sometimes these incentives, but these incentives are not actually producing affordable housing units, and they're not actually sometimes producing affordable housing units that remain affordable in perpetuity. Sometimes they are affordable for a prescribed period of 10, 15, 25 years, inclusive of a 5-year phase out period. And as a result, we're losing those homes, those housing units. So I think that we need to have better policies and where different levels of government are working together to actually produce affordable rental units, and also ensuring that these units remain affordable in perpetuity.
Gila, step on in.
Thank you. And I guess just building off what Nimoy said, one of the things we see as well is policies tend to be quite broad when they are put in place. And what we recognize is, often some of our challenges in the GTA or GTHA are quite unique. And so something, a policy that's federal and a housing program that could work elsewhere needs different levers and tools and layers here. Similarly, provincially, as we have policies that could work well in different parts of Ontario, but perhaps not in the same way in the GTA. And so I think, there's absolutely a contradiction of, policies based on different levels of government, but I think there's also somewhat of a challenge about broad sweeping policies applying to, very different cities and regions the same way, which hasn't been working very well.
Isabel?
Yeah, I just want to pick up on a couple points that were made. I agree, Nimoy, with kind of short-term policies right now. We do need to think of the long-termism, and just also to pick up on collaboration and partnerships. Trust is really critical. So we've seen in some of the examples that were noted a role for the non-for-profit sector to convene and support dialogue and some of this trust building. Gila, you said something about policies being really broad, and we know that the program and policy tools of governments are large scale and they are broad reaching, but neighborhood change happens locally and it's felt locally by the people in communities. And so I think we also need to bring communities more into the conversation and to engage trusted partners almost as a mechanism to help engage the community and build some of that trust that's so critical.
So you all raise an interesting premise. If we go back a couple decades on Nimoy's chart, sort of in the late 70s, early 80s, one would say that the role of the private sector and the public sector, in particular the public sector with regards to housing, was one to offset what the capital market could not address in terms of needs. And then as we've moved through in the last several decades, there's been some successful public-private partnerships in terms of collaboration between different sectors. In some respects, blurring those lines, and in some respects, the public sector leaning on the private sector to take on more of the responsibility financially even. I mean, we had a time when the city of Toronto had a much more hefty bank account for housing. So in this context, and knowing that in the private sector, there's a big push for things like ESGs, who should be leading, or where should the leadership come from to leverage this positive situation? And Derek has his hand up immediately.
Thanks, Leslie. I certainly think that the private sector has a role to play and should be contributing to this, but the scale of the problem is such that private sector alone cannot solve it. And as you said, governments used to be very involved in the housing business, and everywhere in other jurisdictions in the world where they've had more success in delivering affordable housing, governments have made significant investments in housing to make it more affordable. At the end of the day, there is no other entity other than provincial and federal governments who have the resources to actually make the investments that are necessary. It should not be left to them solely, but without them, I don't think that we can actually make a material dent in the problem.
Nimoy?
I think I would hold a different view. Like one of the things that's always been suggested is that, you know, we need to have more public-private partnerships. But the difficulty I have with public-private partnerships is the fact that with the private sector and private corporations and private entities, they have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize returns. So how do we you know, move in the direction to acknowledge a human rights-based approach to housing if a corporation has a fiduciary responsibility to maximize returns? I've yet to see where that is possible, considering that a lot of these corporations have to answer to investors and shareholders. So and the need to maximize returns, which is not aligned with you know, sometimes in keeping housing affordable and providing greater security to Canadians with respect to housing.
Thanks, Nimoy. Craig, you want to dive in?
Yeah, I think you raised some interesting points there, Nimoy, and I agree that it sort of depends on who the players are at the table, and those different motives can have an impact. I would say that in terms of you know, who has to tackle this, it really is an all hands on deck approach. I completely agree with Derek. Like we need provincial and federal money as part of the solution, and particularly for, if you know, we look at the way I laid out the problem, the three different tranches, the social and affordable are areas where we absolutely need, you know, deep government support, ongoing funding, and a commitment to both build and ensure that those units can continue to be maintained and operated. And I think on the attainable side, you know, knowing that government money is not unlimited, I think that an appropriate way is to try and focus those resources as much as possible on delivering those below market units that we desperately need, and where that money, you know, needs to ensure that those projects can happen, and then see what else government can do to clear the way for both private developers and not-for-profit developers to access existing land and resources, and then build as many market rate units as possible, because we need more units at every income level, and if we aren't building more at that mid to high end of the range, if the market isn't providing enough for people in that category, then that's when that provides added pressure on units at a lower price level and starts driving those rates up even more in that competition.
So I'm just going to take us down this road about what government can do. And so, of course, many of you know, Bill 23, the legislation for more housing built faster, is targeting the removal of barriers to get shovels in the ground. Our good friend John Lawrence just wrote in the Globe and Mail, and I quote, "Its government's powers are far more limited when it comes to the other factors that exacerbate the affordability crisis. For example, worsening shortages of skilled trades construction workers and spiking interest rates and supply chain snafus that give up the price of construction materials," unquote. So based on that, is the cure worse than the disease? So as we think about the public policy, the legislation, money coming from the feds, some money coming from the province, all the efforts the City of Toronto is putting in place, are they all on the wrong track, or some of it on the right track? Let's finally answer the question that was the premise of the whole panel. Derek, your hand is up, or is that an elder,
Yep, no.
A senior, older hand?
That was my. So listen, none of the policies that the government's coming out with are perfect. I think they're generally, there's lots of good stuff in there, and hopefully over the course of the next few months, they'll be refined to make them better. But I want to focus on one of the points that you raised earlier, which is about how we build. I do think that the level of the crisis at this point has gotten to the point where I'm hopeful that we can actually, as part of a whole bunch of the other things that we talked about today, is actually look at building buildings differently. There's a lot of discussion about how labor productivity in the construction sector has not changed in the last 70 years. We build buildings very inefficiently, and I do hope that the crisis is at the point now where we can actually look at very different ways of building things. So the industrialization of the construction process, just being more efficient, building faster, building higher quality buildings is an opportunity, I think, that could be a game changer in helping to address it. In and of itself, it's not the magic bullet, silver bullet. I'm not at all suggesting that, but I do think that that is a key opportunity that we shouldn't lose sight of as part of a broad selection of things that we can do to help solve this problem. There are technologies that are out there today that are not being used because the industry has always done things a certain way and is very reluctant to change. And I really do think this is an opportunity to do things differently.
Gila?
And I'll maybe touch on a different solution related to what you mentioned, Leslie, as it connects to some of those skilled labor shortages. So that's certainly another area for government policy as well. We know that there are challenges with the, current points-based immigration system, and how do we, if we're looking at 500,000 new immigrants a year to the country, how is some of that based on sort of skill in the areas that we need it, like construction, for example. And then it's also, not just immigration policy, but education policy as well. How do we, in schools, show that careers in construction, in the trades, can actually be quite successful and really strong economic pathways? That's something we do quite a bit in our work, looking at social impact, is how do we, create apprenticeship and career pathway opportunities in those sectors to help alleviate some of those issues. So it's not just looking at this from a housing policy angle, but education, immigration, again, all hands on deck, all of society. What are the tools we have versus, okay, we're going to address this only with folks who work in the box of housing.
Thanks, Gila. Nimoy.
Yeah, so I definitely agree. I definitely agree that with Derek that it's not the magic pill, and it's not going to solve all of our issues. I think there's a couple of things that I think we didn't really touch on even in this conversation, and I think even with this bill touches on, is household income. We've seen that household income is not kept apace in terms of rising housing costs, and so while we can build all this housing, what policies are we doing to into ensuring that people have livable wages that can afford the housing that we're actually trying to provide? I think that's something that I think that the bill doesn't address. And then with respect to when we think about, I think Gila mentioned in terms of construction. We know that construction costs are through the roof right now, and developers are pausing on or putting projects on hold. And so I anticipate, especially in this rising inflationary period, and I anticipate that when rates do start to come down, we're going to find ourselves in a even more difficult position, because the fact that projects have been put on pause, and then when rates start to fall, we don't actually have the supply to actually address the increase in demand that we are going to anticipate in the market within the next 2 to 3 years because of this current climate that we're in.
Anybody else? Isabel, before any last words, because we're going to start closing off this part of our conversation shortly.
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. Just want to kind of echo, I guess, Gila, some of your comments on really needing a comprehensive strategy. I think we can look at, and this is happening across the region, but how can we strengthen kind of leveraging the housing projects to support also some of the training through, whether that's community benefit agreements or other kind of workforce agreements, just as one example. I mean, it's just so interconnected in the city's kind of ecosystem that, you can't tackle one issue at the expense of others. I think we really do need a comprehensive look at everything.
Can I just use moderator's prerogative to ask the panel this question? So there's a feeling that everybody to solve for this, it needs lots of different players, not just the players that are on the scene right now. Is it because I keep asking this question. So who should lead the charge? And is the charge one charge, or is it one project at a time incrementally? I'm just trying to sort of translate all the
Leslie,
great
I'm gonna
advice.
apologize. And
Oh,
I'll use
Richard's going to
host-
interrupt.
I'll trump moderator's
Oh, it's
prerogative.
1
and host
o'clock. I
prerogative. It
apologize,
is 1
Richard.
o'clock. So that's a question, and there's a bunch of questions in the Q&A that we didn't get to as well. And we said we probably wouldn't get to them, but we're going to make sure they're really some really great questions, and we're going to use them to feed future programming. But it's 1 o'clock. We always end on time, and so I'm not even going to speak to this slide other than to say that you can see on our website a lot of future events. We have 7 in total, including the 5 webinars at lunchtime on this series this week. So we hope you'll tune into those. And with that, I wish everybody a great week. Thank you to the panelists. Not going to run your names down because we're going to end on time as we do at ULI Toronto. So thank you all. What a great way to start the week.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks to the panelists.